Welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello, my name is Barry Schwenk. I am a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host for Two Roads Crossing. What exactly does a Christian veterinarian look like? Is it possible that we might have some cultural biases that actually shape the answer to that question? Well, today we're going to be exploring the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine by talking about the gospel and culture with a former veterinary missionary and CVM area director, Dr. Karen Stoufer. Karen, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
How's your morning going so far?
Good. Very good.
Are you officially retired? Is that the...
Yes, I did. I retired in 2022.
So that made, let's see, your time with CVM then was probably what, 82 years, 92 years? No, it's closer
Close.
to
Close. It was 32.
32 years.
32 years with CVM, the first 13 of which were overseas.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you that next. So the breakdown. So you were as a veterinary missionary with your husband Ron and your daughters. You were in Nepal. I know you said it was 13 years.
13 in Nepal. Yes.
And then when was it that you transitioned back to the U.S.? Do you remember?
In 2003.
Oh, okay. And what was that role that you took on?
I came back to the Seattle office to serve as director of training, and also then as we developed the regional director model as the director for Asia.
So the number of hats that you've worn has been way too many. But I appreciate it. Well, and it's been good because I'm one of those people I think that have that I had never experienced CVM without you. And so it's nice to sit down and chat with you. And I've really been looking forward to this conversation because there's this question, and in these podcasts we're trying to explore how veterinary medicine and faith intersect, and there's some really unique questions and some things that I've struggled with over the years, and I'm sure that other people have struggled with as well. And for me, it was this idea of how culture and faith fit together. So my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian veterinarian was, what I found over time was horribly skewed by a cultural bias. And I've heard you talk about this before, and so I'm hoping that we can share some information that folks will be able to use. So how did you first get interested or begin to explore this topic of culture and gospel?
Well, serving in Asia, like I said, with all that experience, and I had a lot of very good cultural support from national friends and colleagues there were still a lot of cultural things that I didn't really understand, or I only understood very superficially. And we knew that the gospel, as it was being presented, was really difficult for the Hindus and Buddhists that we worked with to understand, although they had an attraction to the concept of a loving God. And so then I read a small paperback book on the 3D Gospel by Jason Georges and realized that this was what was missing in my understanding of a more deep level of the cultural presentation for the gospel. So then I went on and did some more reading and took a course by the author of the book. And I came to realize this was not just something to help me understand ministry in a foreign country, but also for myself as an American Christian to understand the so-called 3D gospel. It refers to looking at the gospel through three different spiritual worldviews.
Well, and that's and I should mention for the folks listening, the book, The 3D Gospel by Jason Georges, is a great resource. And as we're going to talk through it a little bit, over the next couple of sessions. But for folks that are looking for more information, that's a great book to pick up, and it's really an easy read. There is sometimes, and especially on a topic that's as what I think is as robust and as complex as culture and gospel, it's actually a really easy read. So for folks that are looking for some great bedtime reading, that's the way to go. But you mentioned that this is great for certainly within a cross-cultural context, but even for folks that are working within the U.S., is this something that is also relevant and necessary?
Absolutely. I think so. I think every one of us has a little bit of the three worldviews, even though usually one of them is more dominant. So these three worldviews that I'm talking about, these are a guilt innocence perspective that's kind of focused on justice concepts, an honor shame perspective that's focused on saving face, is what it's called in some cultures. And then the third view would be a fear power perspective focused on controlling power. So here in North America, we're predominantly focused on justice. We're very individualistic. When we do something wrong, we think, oh, I made a mistake. Guilt is all about what you do. And we have a lot of focus on rules and right and wrong. When a person's guilty, we punish them, and we force them to apologize or to do restitution, to pay fines, do community service, go to jail. Basically, we try to right the wrong. And that's not true in other cultural worldviews. So, for instance, in Asia and the Middle East, they're predominantly focused on honor and shame, and it's called saving face in some cultures. But in America and other parts of the world, there are significant parts that also focus on honor and shame. It doesn't focus on what you do, but shame is about who you are. It's strongest in communal cultures with a group identity. So when you make a mistake, you don't think I made a mistake. You say, I am a mistake. And honor can just be defined as your social worth. And if a person brings shame on their community or their extended family, people may go into hiding or exile or commit suicide out of shame, or sometimes try to regain honor through acts of terrorism or revenge. And then the third part is the fear power perspective. And it's strongest in parts of Africa and the Caribbean, as well as other places. Cultures are focused on the source of power that you can connect with or have access to. It's common in animistic cultures with a fear of invisible powers, but it's also seen in voodoo, in witchcraft, or most commonly in North America, in astrology. When a person feels powerless, fearful, they try to connect with a source of power through magic or rituals, charms, spells, sacrifices. So I think if we're only looking at the gospel through one of those lenses, we're missing out on some of what the gospel has to say to us.
Well, and that's so when we talk about, like you mentioned, the 3D aspect of the gospel, I think that it's pretty evident. And you mentioned that for generally for most North Americans, we have this guilt innocence perspective, which means that if we fail to see the other cultural heart tendencies towards the gospel, or the way that the heart culturally is more sensitive to the gospel, that can create some real problems, especially as we're wrestling with this idea of, as a Christian veterinarian or a Christian veterinary professional or a Christian just period, right, whose job it is, as we're talking about, even in church, talking about our calling to be witnesses for Christ. The way that we do that is somewhat skewed according to our cultural bias then. So what do you think, when we talk about guilt innocent cultures, and for predominantly North American cultures, let's start there. How is our evangelistic outreach shaped by our cultural bias?
Oh, greatly. I think that I think we definitely present the gospel in the way that naturally tend to present the gospel anyway, unless we learn otherwise, in the way that it was presented to us. And the way that we found resonated with us and we respond to, that's how we think others will also respond to it. But the gospel was actually written in an honor-shame culture in the Middle East, and it uses that kind of language throughout the scriptures. And so understanding the honor-shame concept can help us personally better understand the gospel and also then better present it to others. When we share the gospel here in North America, if we have an understanding of the other perspectives as well, then we can recognize if our friends or neighbors might initially be more receptive to a presentation of the gospel that comes from a different perspective than the one that we naturally respond to. So sharing the gospel using honor, shame, or fear, power might help some people recognize their need for a savior that don't initially recognize that from a guilt innocence sharing. And of course, even beyond North Americans, we live in a multicultural society where we often are sharing cross-culturally.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. So my daughter was talking to me about this just the other day. She was watching The Chosen with some of her friends in college, and one of her friends was really struggling with why the woman with hemorrhage, why she was rejected by her family, why she was cast out. And it was interesting, one of the benefits I think that our family has had in serving the Lord in lots of different contexts is that we're a little bit more sensitive. This is not something that we went into missions thinking about. It's something that God had to teach us along the way. And this idea that we may not even be able to see those other heart language, or I say heart languages because I'm thinking even about love languages, right? The way that we receive love, the way that we give love, there's a natural language to that. And the gospel is kind of the same way. And you mentioned earlier, I want to make sure I understand this. You said that we are all potentially, how did you say that? We're all potentially a little bit of everything. Is that kind of what you had said? I can't remember how you worded it.
I do think we have a little bit of each perspective. When we look at some issues through our dominant guilt innocence, in my case as a North American, but there are times when honor, shame, or fear, power are very relevant to what I'm feeling and experiencing. And I think that's true for everybody, a dominant one, but also others.
Yeah. I mean, that for me, this was kind of eye-opening because growing up kind of in the Bible Belt and this idea purely a guilt innocence overload. It's just what I have. That's a kind of church background that I have. Guilt innocence is pretty predominant. And there was the way that was promoted as far as the way that you experience God, the way that you share God with others, has a lot of this law kind of based language to it. And so we talk about justification. We talk about guilt and innocence. We talk about, those aspects. And then what I was experiencing then as I was growing in my faith and beginning to share the gospel, I didn't quite understand why it wasn't resonating with others the same way that it was resonating with me. Like, how can you not see this? And how is it, for folks that are trying to grow in that, how is it what's the best way to begin to understand how to approach the gospel in that three-dimensional kind of perspective?
I think it takes time, but I think once you learn, for instance, about the honor shame perspective, you'll never read scripture the same again. All of a sudden, these words like honor and shame, or glory is honor and disgraced is shame, will just jump out at you all over the place. And you'll realize all kinds of depths to scriptures that you've known for years and didn't recognize the other aspects of it. I think it's important to remember that all three perspectives are right and true. Just because I'm using an honor shame viewpoint doesn't make my guilt innocence perspective any wrong or less true. It's just like learning a foreign language. In order to speak to someone in another country or even here that doesn't speak English, I have to use another language. But just because I'm not using English doesn't make English wrong or untrue. So learning to share the good news of Jesus Christ in words that will effectively bring people to see the truth of the gospel doesn't make our own perspective wrong. It just recognizes people resonate to other kinds of presentations.
The first time I remember we were walking through the book of Job last year, and I remember reading, Job said, I am declared innocent, and yet I hang my head in shame. And I remember thinking, as I've come to recognize, and especially through a lot of what you have shared over the years, begin to see those points of honor shame within Scripture, and think, oh my goodness, there it is. There's a great example right there where, though I'm declared innocent, I have shame, and that's a big deal. And then the question, becomes, how do we approach that? Because I think as a tendency, we go into even a cross-cultural situation from our own bias. And the idea is that in order to connect, we almost expect others to have to change to our bias so that way they can understand what we're saying. Even in one of the things that we ran into in Ethiopia, we were doing some translation work. And with a lot of the translators, they had learned English so that they could help us with this translation work, but we didn't speak their tribal language. So they were learning English so that way they could help us translate into another language. And I remember we had been doing some Bible storying, and we were talking about when Peter and Jesus were walking on the water. And at the end of this whole session, we had this whole session, teaching it and translating it. The translator asked, he's like, why did they just walk on the water? And I didn't quite understand. And when I asked, I'm like, so what, as we dug deeper, he didn't understand, because we lived in the desert, the high desert of Ethiopia. He had never seen a lake before in his entire life. And so for him, walking across water meant there's a puddle of water on the ground and you walk. There wasn't anything miraculous about it. He didn't understand how Peter could falling and Jesus picking him up would have been such, and for me, it was such an important thing. Where is his faith? Peter was guilty of not having faith. And how is this? And a lot can get lost in the translation when you're trying to get someone else to learn your language so that you can connect with them. Did you ever experience anything like that in your mission time where there was maybe a little bit lost in that gospel heart translation?
Often overseas. I was talking with a woman who had been coming and visiting the church for a couple of years. I think she'd been coming to the little local church, which was all in her language, and she understood the language. And then I discovered she didn't know what a cross was. Yeah, that's how they killed him. But what in the world is a cross? There was a word for it, but is it like an X on tic-tac-toe? What's a cross? And luckily I had a picture to go get and show her. And she just had this big aha moment of something she'd been hearing for a couple of years. And I'm glad you mentioned Job, because that is such a good example of honor shame. You think of this person who has suffered so long, and at the end, it doesn't say that God forgave his sins. It does say that he had his honor restored. And that was what was meaningful to that audience, hearing that story. Here in America, I also experienced that when I was attending a BSF class, Bible Study Fellowship. And At the end of the year, many of the students shared a testimony about the impact that Bible Study Fellowship had had on their lives. And one young Chinese American woman stood and shared that she had been coming to Bible Study Fellowship for 7 years and finally, just now, understood her need for God and had accepted Christ into her heart. Now, BSF's a great Bible study. The teachers that I had in my North American City class presented the gospel in a very guilt innocence perspective. And I would just wonder if we had presented it to this Chinese woman in the honor, shame, saving face language, would she have come to faith much sooner than 7 years? She didn't need to convert to a guilt innocence worldview in order to understand the truth of the gospel for her.
And it's interesting because, even as we finished I love what you just said about Job, because at the end of our study, that's the big question. People are like, so did God forgive Job? And like, that's not the point. The point is, did God restore his honor? And that's what God does. And that's, it's interesting when you think, and I appreciate what you said about how there's not one that's right or wrong. The beauty is that the gospel is intended to reach every heart within every culture, within every bias. And if we're going to be effective ministers, like you said about BSF, we kind of get into these ruts a little bit where you do A, B, and C, and the result should be D. And as ministers or as effective ministers of the gospel, any one of them would tell you that you do A, B, and C, and it doesn't always equal D. And sometimes it's because A, B, and C is not the equation that is really going to reach someone. And as we're talking about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a veterinary professional who's sharing faith, if we're approaching it with that cultural bias, we may not be getting the results that we are expecting. It may be rather frustrating because we just haven't come to see the gospel in that particular way. Did you find that in your time overseas, did you find that how easy was that for you to begin to transition the way that you approached sharing the gospel or even just relating to folks? How long did it take for you to make that adjustment? And was that an easy adjustment or was that frustrating for you?
I'm still making adjustments. I'm still learning more. And it makes me regret a few times that I didn't know it sooner. If only I had known about the honor, shame, and the fear, power aspects of the gospel, I could have done, I think, a better job in a lot of the situations overseas. I wish I had known that sooner.
Well, thankfully, God can do a lot with a little. And
That's right.
From one cracked pot to another, whether we did it perfectly or not, thankfully God can do a lot with whatever we put into his hands. Well, I really want to dig in some more with you about the honor shame culture, how family develops, how relationships develop, maybe even a deeper understanding of the presence of honor shame within the gospel itself. But we're about out of time for today. So can we pick this up next time and maybe start by talking honor shame? Is that
Sounds
reasonable?
great.
All right, perfect. For everybody else, I would say, hope you picked out a couple of nuggets of truth and understanding that maybe you're opening your eyes to some new things, like I have. It's always good to have our understanding, especially our biases, challenged a little bit. So join us next time as I am with Dr. Karen Stoufer once again as we explore honor shame culture and how it relates to the gospel as we explore how to live well together at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you are blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.